Bo cornered me in the parking garage with a crowbar, told Lila her friend Jeremy died this morning, then whispered, if this idiot doesn't move, so will he. When I tried to stand my ground, he smiled and said, careful, these floors are slippery. I just stared at him. That was 8 weeks ago. This morning, he was standing outside my apartment in tears. What's the stupidest thing you ever did for money? One morning in the parking lot of my gym, a woman named Lila offered me $300 cash to pretend to be her workout partner for an hour. She said her ex Bo might show up because he'd been following her to random places lately, and she couldn't be alone with him because he had a horrible temper. You should see what he did to the guy I dated after him, she said, but she didn't elaborate. Lila explained that Bo had been texting her photos of herself at the grocery store, the library, her yoga class, always from a distance, but letting her know he was watching. She hadn't been to the gym in weeks because it was her last safe space, but she couldn't live in fear forever. She handed me the cash and said all I had to do was work out near her and walk her to her car after, that Bo probably wouldn't even show up, but she needed insurance. He had a restraining order and couldn't approach if witnesses were around. I needed the money and figured it was probably just paranoia anyway. For the first 20 minutes, everything was normal, and Lila started to relax, actually smiling as she did her warm-up stretches. She kept checking the door, but gradually stopped looking, focusing on her workout like she was remembering what it felt like to not be afraid. At 7:45, she laughed and said maybe she was being paranoid, that Bo had probably moved on. The truth was, I wasn't hating spending time with her, so when she kept apologizing, I told her it was fine and I meant it. I even thought this would be a cute story for us in the future if I played my cards right, but then the door opened. Bo walked in, and I understood why Lila had been hiding. He was massive, the kind of guy who didn't need steroids because rage was enough of a performance enhancer. His eyes found Lila immediately, and his whole posture changed like a predator catching a scent. Lila froze mid-rep and whispered, he found me, before forcing herself to keep moving. Bo went to the bench press directly facing us and loaded up 4 plates on each side, pressing it like it was nothing while staring at me the entire time. Between sets, he'd flex in the mirror, making sure I could see every muscle, the tattoo on his neck that said, death before dishonor, in Gothic letters pulsing with his heartbeat. After 10 minutes, he moved to the free weights, picking the rack right next to ours, close enough that I could see the veins in his neck pulsing and smell the weird metallic scent of his pre-workout mixed with cologne. When Lila tried to move across the gym, he followed 30 seconds later, maintaining exactly 15 feet like he was showing he could control himself but chose to stay close. He wasn't even breathing hard despite throwing around weights that I couldn't budge. Every time I touched Lila's shoulder to spot her, Bo would slam his weights down hard enough to make everyone look, then pick them back up and do it again, each slam getting louder. At one point, he walked past us to get water and shoulder checked me hard enough to knock me sideways, then said, sorry bro, with this huge smile, while Lila grabbed my arm to steady me. His hand lingered on my shoulder for a second too long, squeezing just hard enough to hurt, and he leaned in close enough that I could feel his breath when he whispered, careful, these floors are slippery. Lila was shaking, and Bo had moved to the cable machine directly behind us, pulling the entire stack with one arm while staring at me. He started talking on his phone loud enough for us to hear. Some guys don't know when they're in over their heads, and it's crazy how many accidents happen in gym parking lots. His voice was calm, but he timed each comment to when I was helping Lila, making sure I knew he was talking about me. Between phone comments, he'd grunt unnecessarily loud with each rep, almost like a growl, primal and threatening. We tried moving to cardio, but Bo got on the treadmill right next to us, running at full sprint without holding the rails, his footsteps pounding so hard the machines shook and my water bottle fell off the holder. When other people tried to use nearby equipment, he'd look at them until they moved away, clearing the space around us. One older guy started to complain, and Bo just stared at him, completely silent, until the man packed up and left the gym entirely. The gym was emptying out, and Lila grabbed my arm saying we needed to leave now while there were still some people around. In the hallway, Bo stayed exactly 15 feet behind us, whistling something cheerful that echoed off the walls. At the water fountain, he stopped to drink, but kept his eyes on us in the mirror, and when Lila fumbled her car keys, he smiled. The parking garage was nearly empty, and our footsteps echoed off concrete. Bo's heavier footsteps stayed exactly 3 seconds behind, until suddenly they stopped. We turned, and he was gone, vanished, and Lila let out this sob of relief and ran toward her car. But when we reached it, Bo was already there, leaning against her driver's door like he'd been waiting for hours. He pushed off the car and looked at me. Not Lila, just me. You should go, he said calmly. This doesn't involve you. That's when I saw the crowbar hanging loose in his hand. Lila's keys fell and she pressed back against me, her voice cracking. That's what you told Jeremy before you put him in the hospital. Bo smiled wider. You didn't hear? Jeremy died this morning, and if this idiot doesn't move, so will he. My legs moved before my brain could process what Bo just said about Jeremy dying. I sprinted toward the emergency exit 20 feet away, but Bo dropped the crowbar with a metallic clang and lunged forward faster than someone his size should move. His massive hand caught my shirt collar and yanked me backward so hard my feet left the ground. The concrete pillar hit my spine first, then my head snapped back against it with a crack that made my vision go white. Lila screamed and ran, but Bo didn't even glance at her, his entire focus on me as his hand moved from my shirt to my throat. His fingers wrapped around my windpipe and squeezed, not hard enough to crush it instantly, but enough that I couldn't get air. Jeremy thought he was brave too, he whispered, his breath hot on my face while I clawed at his grip, my nails digging into his wrists, but not even making him flinch. Black spots started dancing at the edges of my vision, and my chest burned for oxygen. My hands scrambled for anything, finding his face, trying to gouge his eyes, but he just turned his head slightly and kept squeezing. Everything was going dark when my knee came up on pure instinct and connected hard with his groin. He made a sound like a wounded animal, and his grip loosened just enough for me to to suck in one desperate breath before I shoved him and stumbled toward the stairwell door. Behind us, Lila was screaming our location into her phone, telling 911 there was an attempted murder in progress at the Fitness Plus parking garage. Bo was bent over cursing, one hand on his groin, but already starting to straighten up, his face twisted with rage. The emergency door was heavy, and I slammed into it shoulder first, nearly falling through when it opened. I grabbed the railing to keep from tumbling down the concrete steps as Bo's footsteps started moving again behind me, slower but steady. The door slammed shut, and I half ran, half fell down the stairs, my hand sliding along the metal railing for balance while my legs shook from adrenaline. Above me, the door crashed open again, and Bo's footsteps thundered on the stairs, taking them two at a time. I burst through the door at the bottom into the gym's main floor, where at least 20 people were working out on various machines. "Call security, he's trying to kill me," I gasped, my voice raspy from being choked. Everyone turned to stare as Bo emerged from the stairwell 10 seconds later, but something had changed completely. He was walking casually now, even smiling a little, like we'd just finished a friendly workout together. Coach Tony Valdez rushed over from the front desk, asking what was wrong, looking between me and Bo with confusion. Bo walked to the water fountain and took a long drink, watching me with dead eyes over the stream of water while I tried to explain what just happened. Members started pulling out their phones, some recording, others calling 911. Bo stayed exactly where he was, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, completely calm, like nothing had happened. 5 minutes later, Officer Kyle Brooks walked through the front door, his hand resting on his service weapon as he assessed the situation. Bo immediately started talking in this reasonable voice, staying exactly 15 feet from Lila, who had just entered from the parking garage. He told the officer I had attacked him in the parking garage after harassing his ex-girlfriend, that I was some guy she'd hired to intimidate him. Lila showed Officer Brooks the restraining order on her phone, her hands shaking so bad she almost dropped it, explaining the $300 arrangement while Bo smiled. "Check his pocket," Bo said calmly. "He took money to assault me." The cash was still there in my gym shorts, 3 folded hundreds that suddenly made me look like hired muscle instead of a victim. Officer Brooks looked at the money, then at my bruised throat, then back at Bo, who hadn't moved from his spot by the water fountain. 20 minutes later, we were at the police station, and Detective Angela Rivera was reviewing security footage on her computer screen. The cameras showed Bo following us through the gym, maintaining distance, then following us to the parking garage, but the actual confrontation happened in a blind spot. She looked up from the screen and explained that while the restraining order violation was clear, without footage of the actual assault, it was my word against his. I'm trying to figure out why Lila picked this specific guy from the parking lot. Was it just random, or did she notice something about him that made her think he'd help? The $300 payment complicated things because it could be seen as evidence I was paid to confront him. Lila pulled up screenshots on her phone of all the stalking photos Bo had sent her. Pictures of her at the grocery store, the library, her yoga class, but Rivera said they needed more for attempted murder charges. She took our statements and said she'd follow up, but I could see in her eyes she thought this was just some domestic dispute that got out of hand. By 2 in the afternoon, I was at my sister Nina's apartment, and she was examining my throat, taking photos with her phone of the purple bruises shaped like fingers. She kept lecturing me about taking money from strangers while she documented everything, saying I was lucky to be alive. Nina was in her second year of nursing school and insisted we go to the ER for official documentation because her professor had taught them about domestic violence cases needing medical evidence. When I told her about Jeremy dying that morning, her face went completely pale and she grabbed her car keys. At the ER, the doctor found laryngeal trauma consistent with strangulation and ordered x-rays to check for fractures. He asked if I wanted to file assault charges while a nurse took more photos for the medical record. A social worker showed up with pamphlets about domestic violence, explaining that strangulation was one of the biggest predictors of future homicide attempts, that victims were 7 times more likely to be killed by their attacker. Nina recorded everything on her phone, the doctor's assessment, the social worker's warnings, saying we needed our own evidence since the police hadn't seemed to take it seriously enough. When we got back to Nina's apartment complex at 7 that evening, Bo's black Challenger was idling in the visitor parking area, positioned exactly at the property line where he wasn't technically trespassing. His music was so loud it rattled the windows of nearby apartments, bass thumping through the walls, and every few minutes he'd rev the engine hard enough to set off car alarms. Nina called 911, but the dispatcher said since he was on public property and hadn't made any threats or attempted to approach us, there was nothing they could do. We watched from her 3rd floor window as he sat there for 3 hours, occasionally getting out to stretch, always looking up at Nina's window to make sure we saw him. Other residents complained to the apartment security, but the guard said his hands were tied if the guy wasn't breaking any laws. Finally, at 10:30, Bo drove away, tires squealing, and I collapsed on Nina's couch checking my phone. My social media was flooded with messages from gym members who had filmed the incident. One video showed Bo's face when he came through the stairwell door, pure murderous rage shifting to calm control in less than 2 seconds. Another member had caught him picking up the dropped crowbar from the parking garage while everyone was focused on me in the gym. Derek, a guy I barely knew from the morning workout crowd, sent me a direct message saying he'd seen Bo slash someone's tires in the gym parking lot last month, but had been too scared to report it. The next morning, I called my other job at the smoothie shop to say I couldn't come in, my voice still raspy and painful from the strangulation. My manager was understanding, but said he'd have to find someone to cover my shifts for the rest of the week. Then Coach Tony texted that I was suspended from teaching fitness classes pending investigation, citing member safety concerns after yesterday's incident. Without those 2 jobs, I couldn't make rent this month, and my bank account was already negative from last month's car repair. Lila kept texting apologies, saying she never thought Bo would actually try to kill someone. everyone, offering to pay for a lawyer, but I didn't even know what to say back. My phone rang at 10 the next morning, and Angela's voice was flat when she told me they'd arrested Bo for violating the restraining order, but he'd posted bail in 2 hours. She said Jeremy Huang's case file showed the exact same pattern. Some kid hired to protect a woman, attacked in a parking structure, then dead from head trauma after supposedly falling downstairs. The case went cold when every witness suddenly changed their story or moved away. She told me to vary my routines and stay unpredictable, then hung up before I could ask what that meant. An hour and a half later, my coworker Jenna sent me a photo from the smoothie shop showing Bo at the counter, ordering a protein shake while staring directly at my usual workstation behind the register. She texted that he'd asked about my schedule, said he was a concerned friend worried about me, and when she told him I wasn't working today, he went and sat in his car in the parking lot for an hour, just watching the door. My manager texted 5 minutes later saying I needed to resolve my personal issues or find another job because customers were complaining about the scary guy asking questions. Nina picked me up at 2 and drove us downtown to meet Lila at this coffee shop with big windows where we could see anyone approaching. Lila's hands shook as she pulled out her phone and showed us texts from someone named Blake, who turned out to be Bo's twin brother, and a paralegal who helped him navigate legal loopholes. The texts threatened to sue her for defamation if she kept spreading lies about Bo, with screenshots of legal documents and case citations that looked real enough to be scary. She said Jeremy had gotten the same legal threats 3 weeks before he died, that Blake had filed complaints with Jeremy's employer claiming harassment until they fired him. When I got back to Nina's place, I looked up Jeremy online and found this memorial page his mom maintained with all the comments turned off. His Instagram showed a normal 25-year-old guy doing normal stuff until 3 months ago when everything just stopped. The last video was from a party where he was laughing with friends, but in the background you could see Bo standing by the wall just watching him. The timestamp showed it was 3 days before Jeremy died. That night, Nina drove me to my apartment to grab more clothes, and when we got there, the door was hanging open, the frame splintered where someone had kicked it in. Nothing was stolen, but everything had been moved exactly 1 inch. Every drawer pulled out 1 inch. Every picture frame turned backward. My bed shifted just enough that you'd notice, but couldn't prove it was intentional. The landlord met us there and said the security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned between 6 and 7, right when this happened. On my pillow was a gym flyer with "See you soon" written across it in red marker. Angela came the next morning to examine everything, taking photos and measurements while explaining that breaking and entering charges required proof of who actually entered, not just suspicion. She mentioned Bo had an alibi because he was supposedly at a job interview across town with 3 people who'd swear he was there the whole time. She bagged the gym flyer for handwriting analysis, but warned me these cases usually escalate before they get resolved, that guys like Bo push boundaries until someone gets hurt bad enough for real charges. Nina grabbed my arm and said I was staying with her indefinitely. No arguments. I spent the next few hours emailing my professors about needing extensions, attaching the police report numbers as proof of my family emergency. 2 wrote back with sympathy and gave me extra time, but my statistics professor said I still had to take the midterm or fail the class. I hadn't thought about school in days, and my normal life felt like something that happened to someone else. Nina brought me clothes from my apartment, saying the door was fixed, but she'd grabbed what she could carry. That afternoon, Lila came to Nina's place with this cardboard box full of evidence she'd been collecting for 2 years. She spread out photos of slashed tires, printed emails with threats, medical records from when Bo had broken her wrist accidentally during an argument. She played us voicemails where his voice got quieter and calmer the angrier he got, promising to find her no matter where she went. She started crying as she admitted she'd hired 3 other guys before me for protection, but they'd all backed out after Bo confronted them in private. She thought I looked tough enough in the gym to actually scare him, thought maybe someone teaching fitness classes could handle themselves. Around 7 that evening, Coach called and his voice was tight when he told me Bo had joined the gym as a premium member with a year paid in advance. Legally, he couldn't ban him without cause, and the restraining order only covered Lila, not the whole facility. Bo had signed up to teach a free self-defense class for female members tomorrow, which Coach couldn't stop without risking a discrimination lawsuit. He told me not to come to the gym anymore, that his insurance company was threatening to drop coverage after the parking garage incident. Without the fitness classes and the smoothie shop, I had no income left. 3 days later, I sat in the courthouse for Bo's restraining order violation hearing, watching his brother Blake argue that the parking garage was technically separate property from the gym, so no violation occurred. Blake had property surveys and lease agreements showing different ownership entities, explaining that the restraining order specified the gym premises, but didn't explicitly include adjacent structures. The judge looked annoyed, but granted a 2-week continuance to review the property lines and determine if a violation had actually occurred. Bo turned and smirked at me from across the courtroom, while Blake filed a counter-complaint, alleging I'd assaulted his client for money, claiming I'd taken payment to intimidate Bo, and had initiated the confrontation in the garage. The way Bo moved every single thing in the apartment exactly 1 inch is making my brain spin. How did he even measure that? Did he bring a ruler, or just eyeball it to make everything feel wrong without being obvious? The next morning, Nina drove us to a legal aid clinic downtown, where a law student named David looked over our paperwork while chewing on his pen cap. He spread out the police reports and photos across his desk, shaking his head every few seconds, then explained that without witnesses to the actual strangulation, we had no case for prosecution, but might get a protective order if we documented everything. He handed us a safety planning worksheet with boxes to check about varying our routines, using different exits, installing cameras, basically living like fugitives in our own city. Nina took notes while I stared at the bruises bruises on my neck in the reflection of his office window, purple and green now like some sick watercolor painting. David kept saying we needed to be careful, that guys like Bo knew exactly how far they could push without crossing legal lines, and I wanted to laugh because legal lines meant nothing when someone was willing to kill you. We left with a folder full of forms and David's business card, which felt like bringing a paper shield to a knife fight. My phone buzzed as we walked to Nina's car, and Derek from the gym had sent 3 texts in a row. Bo had been at the gym that morning asking members about me, telling everyone I was a drug dealer who'd attacked him over territory, and people were actually buying it because they'd seen the cash exchange. One member had already complained to management about feeling unsafe with me working there, and Derek said Coach Tony was getting pressure from corporate about the situation. The gym's Facebook page had 3 new 1-star reviews, all mentioning dangerous staff and drug activity, posted within minutes of each other from accounts with generic names and no profile pictures. Derek said he'd tried defending me, but Bo had shown people photos of his injuries, claiming I'd jumped him for no reason, and now half the morning crew thought I was some kind of thug. Nina grabbed my phone and deleted the messages, saying I didn't need to read that garbage right now, but the damage was already spreading through the gym community like poison. We spent the afternoon at her apartment going through the safety worksheet, installing a doorbell camera I couldn't afford, when her clinical rotation coordinator called, saying she needed to get her car from the hospital parking garage immediately because it was blocking emergency access. Nina hadn't parked anywhere near the emergency lanes, but we drove over anyway, finding her Honda exactly where she'd left it that morning. The engine wouldn't turn over, just made this grinding sound, and the mechanic who showed up an hour later found sugar in the gas tank, said the whole fuel system was destroyed, $3,000 to fix, maybe more if the engine was damaged, and Nina just stood there staring at her car like she couldn't process what was happening. Security footage showed a hooded figure near her car around noon, but the quality was too grainy for identification, though we both knew exactly who it was. Nina broke down in the hospital parking garage, sobbing that she couldn't afford this, that she had finals coming up and clinical rotations, and now no way to get anywhere. I held her while she cried, feeling the walls closing in, understanding that Bo was systematically destroying our lives without leaving a single fingerprint. That night I couldn't sleep, checking my bank balance over and over, trying to figure out how to help Nina when I had $342 to my name. The next morning my phone rang with an unknown number, and Lila's voice came through, asking if I was okay, saying she'd heard about what was happening. She wired me $2,000 before I could even protest, insisting it was the least she could do since this was all her fault. She mentioned her ex-husband was a sheriff in another county who might be able to help, but then admitted they were in a custody battle, and Bo's brother Blake was representing her ex, so that door was closed too. Every avenue for help seemed to loop back to Bo's influence, his family's connections, the web he'd spun around us. Lila said she was leaving Texas next week, maybe for good, and I couldn't blame her. After she hung up, I sat alone in Nina's apartment while she was at school, jumping at every sound from the hallway, checking the door locks obsessively, like they could actually keep Bo out if he decided to come. The neighbor's dog started barking, and my heart rate spiked so hard I thought I might pass out. Then I realized I hadn't slept more than 3 hours straight since the attack. My phone battery died, and for 10 minutes I couldn't find the charger, panic rising in my throat at being unreachable, at Nina not being able to call if something happened. When I finally plugged it in, 17 missed calls from an unknown number appeared. The next morning my bank called about suspicious activity on my account, someone trying to access it from 3 different branches with a fake ID that looked enough like me to fool one teller briefly. They froze everything pending investigation, leaving me with no access to the money Lila had sent, or even my own pathetic savings. The security officer mentioned this was the 3rd incident this week involving assault victims, like there was some pattern they were tracking. When I opened my wallet to check my cards, Blake Garrett's business card was tucked behind my driver's license, and I knew I hadn't put it there. The message was clear, as Bo wanted it to be. That afternoon, campus security pulled Nina out of her anatomy lab, saying there'd been a complaint about drug dealing from her apartment. Bo had filed an anonymous tip with photos of me entering her building carrying suspicious packages, which were actually just takeout bags from the Thai place down the street. Nina had to meet with student conduct immediately, her professor staring at her like she was contaminated as security escorted her out in front of her entire class. Her scholarship was now under review. 3 years of perfect grades, meaningless against anonymous accusations and grainy photos taken out of context. Nina called me crying from the dean's office bathroom, whispering that they were asking about my presence in her apartment, about any illegal activities, about whether she felt safe. Detective Rivera showed up at Nina's apartment that evening with news that made my stomach drop. Jeremy's mother wanted to meet me, had been investigating her son's death on her own, collecting evidence the police wouldn't look at. Rivera couldn't say much officially, but suggested we hear Mrs. Huang out, mentioned she'd seen this pattern before with stalkers who knew how to work the system. She left Mrs. Huang's contact information on a yellow sticky note, her handwriting careful and deliberate like she was leaving a breadcrumb trail she couldn't officially acknowledge. 2 hours later, we met Mrs. Huang at a diner off I-35, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and fluorescent lights that made everyone look sick. She brought Jeremy's laptop in a canvas bag, her hands shaking as she opened it to show us dozens of videos Jeremy had recorded on his phone and backed up to the cloud. The videos showed Bo following Jeremy for 3 weeks before his death, getting progressively closer, progressively bolder. In one video from a grocery store, Bo stood directly behind Jeremy in line, close enough to breathe on his neck, smiling at the security camera like he wanted to be seen. Another showed Bo's car following Jeremy's for 15 miles, maintaining exactly 3 car lengths like he was showing off his control. control. The final video, taken the night before Jeremy died, showed Bo approaching Jeremy's car at a red light, leaning into the open window to say something the phone barely picked up. Mrs. Huang had paid for audio enhancement, and we could just make out Bo's voice saying tomorrow was decision day, that Jeremy could leave town or leave in a bag. She'd given all of this to the police, but they said the audio was too distorted for court, that following someone wasn't illegal, that threats needed to be explicit and clearly recorded. Mrs. Huang believed me because the pattern was identical, the escalation timeline almost exactly the same, like Bo was following some sick playbook. She showed me the medical examiner's report that listed Jeremy's death as accidental, a fall downstairs that resulted in a broken neck, even though Jeremy lived in a single-story house. The next morning, I woke to my phone exploding with notifications, my uncle calling repeatedly, my cousin sending screenshot after screenshot of something I couldn't process at first. Someone had posted my photo on a revenge porn site with fabricated posts about selling drugs and services at the gym, including Nina's nursing school contact information, and claims that she was involved too. The posts had hundreds of views already, were being shared in local Facebook groups, had been screenshotted and sent to my extended family with messages about being concerned for my well-being. My uncle's voicemail demanded to know if I was really dealing drugs like the posts said, his voice a mix of anger and disappointment that made me want to throw my phone against the wall. 3 days passed with more fake posts appearing faster than I could report them, each one getting shared wider, the lies spreading through Austin's fitness community like poison. Day 7 started with David from legal aid calling at 10 in the morning, his voice excited as he explained that if we could prove Bo was doing this to multiple people across state lines, the FBI's serial stalker unit could take over. He'd already found 2 other victims in Houston and San Antonio, both too scared to come forward unless others did first, both with similar stories of escalating harassment that ended when they disappeared from social media and moved away. Wow. This safety planning worksheet David gave them has boxes for using different exits and changing routines. How does someone even keep track of all those changes every day? David needed documentation showing patterns, evidence that crossed county lines, anything that proved this wasn't just a local dispute, but systematic terror. Nina came over at 2 with poster boards and colored markers, her nursing school training kicking in as she insisted we document everything with medical-level precision, creating timelines that showed every incident with exact timestamps and cross-referenced evidence. We mapped out 3 weeks of attacks on the wall, color-coding different types of harassment, and that's when the pattern jumped out at us. Weekday mornings were for professional sabotage like the fake LinkedIn profiles and employer calls, evenings for personal attacks like the apartment break-in, weekends for legal harassment with police reports and court filings. Bo was running this like a military operation with specific objectives for each phase. At 5, Coach texted warning that Bo had started offering free training sessions to anyone who'd give him information about me, and 3 people had already taken the deal. One guy was telling everyone he'd seen my car at drug houses even though I didn't own a car, clearly being fed lies to create false witness statements. The gym community I'd worked so hard to build relationships in was being turned into a surveillance network against me. The next morning's counter-complaint hearing was a nightmare from the start, with Blake presenting sworn statements from 5 gym members claiming I'd threatened Bo multiple times, their stories matching too perfectly to be real, but convincing enough for the judge. The judge looked skeptical, but said she had to err on the side of caution, granting a mutual restraining order that meant I couldn't go within 100 feet of Bo either. Blake smiled as he explained this meant Bo could effectively ban me from anywhere just by showing up first, controlling my movements by choosing where to be. 4 hours later, Lila called sobbing that her ex-husband had just gotten emergency custody of their kids based on evidence that she'd hired dangerous criminals to stalk people, with Blake representing him pro bono and using my fake criminal record as proof. She was driving to Houston for an emergency hearing, begging me to write a statement saying she didn't know about my supposed violent past, that she'd been tricked too. Her voice broke as she explained that Bo was destroying her life to eliminate witnesses, that her ex had been trying to get the kids for years, and Bo had given him the perfect ammunition. That afternoon, I sat with Mrs. Huang in her living room, looking through Jeremy's journals, page after page of paranoid observations about being followed, about people watching him, about not knowing who to trust anymore. The final entry from 3 days before he died was the worst, his handwriting shaky as he wrote about feeling trapped in an impossible situation where fighting back made him look aggressive, running made him look guilty, and hiding made him disappear completely. Mrs. Huang's hands shook as she showed me Jeremy's bus ticket to California, dated for the day after he died, explaining he'd been planning to start over where Bo couldn't find him. 4 hours later, Nina called me screaming that her clinical supervisor had just suspended her pending investigation for drug-seeking behavior, based on a video that showed her stealing medications from the supply closet. The video was obviously fake when you looked close, her face slightly off like those deepfake apps everyone was using, but convincing enough that the school had to investigate. She threw her textbooks against the wall hard enough to leave dents. 3 years of nursing school about to disappear because someone had spent an hour making a fake video. Without clinical rotations, she couldn't graduate, couldn't take her boards, couldn't become a nurse. Everything she'd worked for destroyed by someone with basic video editing skills. The next morning, Derek from the gym called from a blocked number, whispering that he'd been recording Bo's conversations for days after overhearing him mention something called Phase 3 that would start Sunday and would make him run. Derek had hours of audio on his phone, Bo discussing his plans with Blake, coordinating with people I'd never heard of, building something bigger than just harassment. He was terrified, but willing to share the recordings if we could protect his identity, knowing what had happened to Jeremy and not wanting to be be next. 2 hours later, Angela called with frustration clear in her voice, explaining that Bo's alibi for my apartment break-in had checked out on paper with timestamps and witnesses, but she'd noticed something odd about a gas station receipt that placed him 5 minutes away, not across town like he claimed. She couldn't use it officially without more evidence, but suggested maybe we should check that gas station's security footage ourselves, just for our own safety and peace of mind. That afternoon, Nina and I walked into the gas station where the owner, an older Vietnamese man with thick glasses, recognized Bo's photo immediately and shook his head. "That man Trouble," he said in accented English, already pulling up footage from 3 weeks ago without being asked, showing Bo buying zip ties and work gloves an hour before my apartment was ransacked. The timestamp matched perfectly with the window between his fake alibi timestamps, proof he'd been lying about his whereabouts. The owner burned the footage to a USB drive and handed it over, warning us to be careful because Bo had threatened him once for having cameras that recorded license plates in the parking lot. The next morning, Mrs. Huang called me at 6, asking me to come to her house immediately because she'd found something in Jeremy's room that I needed to see. I drove there in my pajamas and found her sitting at her kitchen table with a box of Jeremy's things, newspaper clippings spread across the surface, her hands shaking as she pushed a photo toward me. The man in the picture looked exactly like Bo, but younger, no neck tattoo, standing next to another guy at what looked like a college party, and Mrs. Huang pointed to the headline on an old Oklahoma newspaper that read, "College Student Dies in Dormitory Accident." She explained that Jeremy had been researching Bo for weeks before he died, discovered his real name was William Thornton, and this William had disappeared right after his roommate died from a fall that looked exactly like what happened to Jeremy. The pattern was identical. The roommate had been dating William's ex-girlfriend, and William vanished the night of the death, never showed up for the police interview, just disappeared completely. Mrs. Huang had more papers showing William Thornton had been wanted for questioning in Oklahoma for 5 years, and she'd already called the detective to report it, but wanted me to have copies of everything first. I took photos of every document while she made copies on her printer, both of us working in silence except for the sound of papers shuffling and the printer humming. By 10 that morning, I was at the legal aid office where David practically jumped out of his chair when I showed him the evidence, immediately calling his friend at the FBI while Nina and I spread everything across his conference table. David kept saying this changed everything because interstate flight from murder charges made it federal jurisdiction, not just local, and his FBI contact specialized in exactly this kind of identity fraud case. We spent 3 hours organizing evidence into folders, creating timelines, cross-referencing dates between Oklahoma and Texas, Nina finding social media posts that showed William Thornton and Bo Garrett had the same tattoos except for the neck one. David's friend at the FBI called back, saying they'd been looking for William Thornton for 3 years in connection with 2 other deaths in different states, all following the same pattern of jealous rage disguised as accidents. For the first time since this started, I felt like we weren't just running and hiding, but actually fighting back, building something that could stop him permanently. Nina had to leave at 2 for a mandatory meeting at her nursing school about her suspension, so I went back to her apartment and started cleaning everything obsessively, needing to control something while I waited. I scrubbed the kitchen counters until my hands were raw, organized her bookshelf alphabetically, folded all her clothes, anything to keep moving and not think about what might happen at her hearing. While putting her notebooks on her desk, I found her journal open to yesterday's entry and couldn't help reading it, even though I knew I shouldn't. She'd written pages about being terrified for me, about how she couldn't sleep knowing Bo was out there, about checking the locks 5 times before bed and keeping a knife under her pillow. The entry from 2 days ago said she'd been practicing self-defense moves on YouTube, trying to be ready if he came for us, and then yesterday's entry just said, "I can't lose my brother to this monster. We survive together or not at all." I sat on her bed and cried for the first time since this whole nightmare started. Really cried, not just the angry tears from before, but deep sobbing that made my chest hurt. Around 5, Derek texted me a file that made my blood run cold, an audio recording he'd made of Bo and Blake talking at the gym yesterday about Bo's contingency plan if things went bad. In the recording, Bo mentioned having a backup identity already established with documents and cash hidden, talking about the same route through Mexico I used before when he left Oklahoma. Blake was giving him advice about destroying evidence, wiping his phone, making sure nothing could be traced, and Bo said something about how he handled Jeremy, but was careful with his words like he knew someone might be listening. The way Mrs. Huang kept all those newspaper clippings about her son's research is making me wonder how long she suspected something was wrong with Bo's story. Did she start looking through Jeremy's things right after he died or wait until now? Derek had been hiding in the locker room recording everything on his phone, risking his safety to get us evidence, and he said in his text that he was leaving Austin tomorrow because he couldn't take the fear anymore. The next morning at 8, Nina and I met Special Agent Carla Matthews at the federal building downtown, a woman who looked like she could bench press Bo herself, who listened to everything without interrupting once. She pulled out a file that was already thick with papers and photos, telling us she'd been tracking William Thornton for 3 years across 4 states, that our evidence matched their pattern analysis perfectly. She needed one specific thing to arrest him immediately, and that was proof he'd used interstate communications for stalking, which we had because the revenge porn posts came from servers in California, according to the IT guy Nina knew. Agent Matthews started making calls right there in front of us, beginning the warrant process, telling someone on the phone to get surveillance on Bo immediately, that they finally had enough for federal charges. At noon, Nina's school hearing went better than we'd hoped when her professor testified that the deepfake video showed her wearing scrubs she didn't own in a medication room she'd never had access to. The timestamp proved she was in a completely different class when the video supposedly supposedly happened, and the investigation immediately shifted to finding who created the false evidence. They lifted her suspension, but said she'd need a supervisor shadowing her for 2 weeks as a formality, which Nina accepted without complaint, just grateful to keep her spot in the program. That afternoon, Lila texted from Houston, where she was staying with her sister, said she'd lost custody temporarily, but her lawyer discovered Blake wasn't even licensed to practice family law, only criminal, making every document he'd filed potentially invalid. Her kids were safe with their father for now, completely away from Beau's reach, and even though she was devastated about the custody, she said we were winning even if it didn't feel like it yet. Around 7 that evening, Nina and I were making dinner when we heard weights slamming in the apartment complex gym, looked out her window, and saw Beau working out while staring directly up at us. Other residents were complaining to the office, but management said he was a guest of someone in the building, so they couldn't make him leave, technically not violating the restraining order since it was a different facility. We watched him bench press massive weights, each rep slow and deliberate like he was imagining crushing us, his eyes never leaving our window even when other people walked between us. Agent Matthews told us to document everything with photos and videos, that the arrest was imminent, but we needed to be careful, to not go anywhere alone, to keep our phones charged and ready to call 911. The next morning, Coach texted asking me to meet him at a park near campus, not at the gym, and when I got there, he looked exhausted and scared but determined. He'd been investigating Beau's background for insurance reasons and found out Beau had worked at 3 other gyms where members had accidents with equipment that failed at exactly the wrong time. Each victim had somehow crossed Beau or complained about him, and Coach had statements from 2 other gym owners who'd banned Beau after suspicious incidents they couldn't quite prove. He apologized for cutting me off initially, explained his lawyer made him stay neutral while secretly gathering evidence, but now he was ready to testify about everything he'd seen and documented. That afternoon, Derek sent one final video before leaving town, security footage from the gym showing Beau tampering with a cable machine a month ago, right before a member who'd complained about Beau's aggressive behavior had the cable snap and nearly crush his throat. The sabotage was subtle, Beau knowing exactly where the cameras were and keeping his body between them and his hands, but from this angle, you could see him loosening bolts and fraying the cable with something sharp. Derek said he was already on the road to Dallas to stay with his parents, too scared to stay in Austin another day, but wanted us to have everything he'd collected over the past 2 weeks. Nina spread Derek's files across her kitchen table alongside Mrs. Huang's research folders while I sorted through public records on my laptop. Each document painted another piece of Beau's real history, or William's history, as we learned his actual name was. Phoenix in 2018 had a college wrestler hospitalized with brain damage after a bar fight. Denver in 2019 showed a roommate falling downstairs and breaking his neck. Oklahoma City in 2020 listed another gym member dying from steroid complications that looked suspicious. San Antonio in 2021 had a coworker drowning in a lake after a company retreat. Each city meant another person dead or permanently injured after crossing him. The FBI agent called while we were connecting the timeline and confirmed they'd linked him to 2 other cases in Nevada and New Mexico. She said the pattern showed clear escalation from assault to murder over 6 years. My phone rang at 8 that night and my old landlord was screaming about my apartment being on fire. The fire department had already determined accelerant was used in my former bedroom where it started. My rental agreement wasn't up for another month, so insurance considered it my problem entirely. Everything I couldn't grab when I moved was gone, including photo albums from college and my grandfather's watch. Beau posted a gym selfie on Instagram at the exact time the fire started with 3 other people visible. The next morning, the agent called with bad news about the warrant being delayed indefinitely. Beau's new lawyer, someone more experienced than Blake, was challenging the interstate commerce angle successfully. She mentioned off the record that Beau had bought a one-way ticket to Mexico City, leaving in 3 days. We needed something dramatic to keep him from running, or he'd disappear forever. Mrs. Huang introduced us to the Johnson family, whose son Tyler was Beau's roommate in Oklahoma before his death. They'd been searching for justice for 5 years and had photos of injuries matching Jeremy's pattern exactly. The bruises on Tyler's arms looked identical to the ones on Jeremy in those hospital photos. Together, our 3 families represented a pattern no reasonable person could ignore or dismiss. The Johnsons were willing to go public with their story if it helped stop him. I sat in Nina's living room recording my video statement for the agent that afternoon. My voice kept breaking as I described the constant fear and looking over my shoulder everywhere. Nina held my hand off camera while I talked about not knowing if today would be the day. The agent said my testimony could be key if we could just keep Beau from fleeing. 2 more days until his flight, and we were running out of options fast. Nina woke me at 6 the next morning with her phone showing texts from our parents. Someone had sent them photos of me supposedly dealing drugs with threats to expose our family's criminal enterprise. Dad was demanding answers while Mom cried in the background about what the neighbors would think. They lived 600 miles away, but Beau had found them and their home address somehow. Nina took the phone and explained everything while I threw clothes in a bag in case we needed to run. Derek posted the gym footage of Beau's steroid rage episodes on social media that morning, tagging local news. Coach reported Beau's membership violations to the National Fitness Association, citing safety concerns for other members. Mrs. Huang started a Justice for Jeremy Facebook page that got 500 shares in 2 hours. We were attacking his reputation from every angle, trying to make him too toxic to ignore. Blake showed up at Nina's apartment that afternoon with a cease and desist letter threatening defamation lawsuits. Nina started recording on her phone while he talked about how we didn't understand family loyalty. He admitted his brother was dangerous, but said family is family no matter what they do. When he realized Nina was recording, he grabbed for her phone, but I stepped between them. He backed off, but warned we had no idea what we were starting with this campaign. The agent called at 5 with more frustrating news about the warrant being sealed by a judge. Blake had clerked for this judge 3 years ago and still had connections, apparently. She was appealing, but it would take 48 hours minimum to get another judge involved. Beau's flight was in 18 hours, and she suggested we find legal ways to ensure he missed it. The system was failing us again, but she promised to keep fighting within legal boundaries. That night, Beau showed up at Nina's clinical site with flowers telling reception he was her boyfriend. He said they'd had a fight, and he wanted to apologize for his behavior earlier. Security wouldn't let him pass the lobby, but he waited there for 3 hours anyway. Nina had to use the loading dock to leave while security watched him in the lobby. He must have seen her car because he followed her for miles through Austin traffic. She drove straight to the police station, and he only backed off when she pulled into the lot. The desk sergeant said following someone wasn't illegal unless he made actual threats or touched her. 3 days passed with Beau testing every boundary while staying just inside the law. My phone rang at 5 in the morning, and Mrs. Huang was crying on the other end. She'd hired a private investigator who'd found Beau's storage unit near the airport filled with fake IDs and cash. The PI couldn't legally go inside, but took photos through a gap showing at least 3 different passports and a gun. Mrs. Huang said she was sending everything to the FBI agent and every news station in Austin right now. I'm trying to understand how Beau managed to time that gym selfie perfectly with the apartment fire. Did he plan it down to the minute, or was that just crazy luck? By 8 that morning, the story was everywhere with the headline, "Serial Stalker Terrorizes Austin Gym Community," running on every local channel. Beau's photo filled the screen while reporters stood outside our gym interviewing members about their experiences with him. Within an hour, 3 more people called the station saying Beau had stalked them too over the past 5 years. Coach went on camera telling everyone that Beau was banned from every gym in their network across Texas immediately. The news kept playing security footage of Beau following me through the parking garage, while experts talked about escalating violence patterns. My phone buzzed non-stop with messages from people who'd believed Beau's lies, now apologizing and offering support. Blake called at 11 screaming that Beau was at his office destroying everything and throwing computers through windows. We could hear glass breaking and Blake yelling for someone to call 911 before the line went dead completely. 10 minutes later, Blake texted that Beau was gone, but not before trashing the entire office and threatening to kill him. Blake said Beau kept screaming that Blake ruined everything by getting too many people involved in their plan. The brothers' partnership was completely destroyed, and Blake was finally scared enough to cooperate with police himself. Nina and I sat in the FBI office at 1, while agents coordinated with airport security about Beau's 3 o'clock flight. Every minute felt like forever, as we gave separate statements to different agents about everything that had happened. One agent mentioned they'd been tracking someone named William Garrett in Oklahoma for years, but never had enough evidence. She said William disappeared 3 years ago, right when Beau showed up in Austin with perfect timing. The pieces were coming together, showing this wasn't Beau's first time running from crimes using fake identities. My phone lit up at 3:15 with a call from the FBI agent saying airport security had Beau in custody. He'd tried boarding with a fake ID matching one from the storage unit photos and fought when confronted. Security footage showed him breaking a TSA agent's nose and throwing another into a wall before being tackled. Every news channel had the video within minutes, showing Beau in handcuffs being dragged through the terminal screaming threats. The agent said he was facing federal charges for assaulting federal officers and identity fraud on top of everything else. She warned that while we'd won this round, the legal battle was just starting and could take months. The next morning, we sat in federal court watching Beau's arraignment, where he pleaded not guilty to all charges. The prosecutor mentioned potential murder charges pending investigation into Jeremy's death, which made Mrs. Huang sob quietly behind us. Beau stared at me the entire hearing, and when the judge looked away, he mouthed, "You're dead," slowly. The judge denied bail, calling him an extreme flight risk, and for the first time in 2 weeks, he was locked up. Nina went back to her clinical rotations that afternoon, with a supervisor shadowing her for safety and support. Her supervisor turned out to be understanding and even impressed by how Nina had documented everything during our ordeal. The other nursing students who doubted her story apologized after seeing the news coverage of Beau's arrest. Nina texted me that taking blood pressure felt weird after everything we'd been through, but at least normal existed somewhere. Detective Rivera showed up at my apartment the next morning with news that made Mrs. Huang cry with relief. They were reopening Jeremy's case as a homicide based on the gas station footage I'd found weeks ago. The video showed Beau following Jeremy that night, which completely destroyed his original alibi about being home. Rivera said Blake was cooperating fully now and providing evidence of Beau's crimes in Oklahoma for immunity. Blake had records of everything, including photos Beau had sent him of previous victims he'd hurt. The detective said with Blake's testimony and the new evidence, Beau would likely never see freedom again. Lila drove up from Houston that afternoon, having won back custody after Blake's fake documents were exposed in court. She met us at a coffee shop and kept apologizing while explaining she'd known Beau was dangerous but was too scared to handle it alone. She'd started a support group for stalking victims and wanted to help others avoid what we went through. Before leaving, she handed me an envelope with $2,000, saying it wasn't enough, but it was what she could afford. That night, I slept 8 hours straight for the first time since the gym incident 3 weeks ago. Nina made pancakes the next morning, and we ate without mentioning Beau's name once, which felt like progress. My phone had dozens of messages from gym members apologizing for believing Beau's lies about me being the stalker. Coach called offering me my job back with a raise and promised better security measures were already being installed. Everything felt like coming up from underground after being buried, but I still checked every lock through 3 times. I still looked over my shoulder constantly and jumped when doors opened too fast, but at least Bo was locked up. The federal prosecutor called saying Bo's trial would start in 6 months and we'd all need to testify. She said with everything they had now, including Blake's cooperation, Bo was looking at 25 to life minimum. 3 days later, the FBI agent called saying Blake wanted to talk and had evidence that would change everything. I drove to the federal building downtown where Blake sat in a small room with his lawyer, 2 agents, and boxes of notebooks he'd kept hidden for years. His hands shook as he opened the first journal and started reading dates, names, methods that Bo had used to hurt people going back 6 years. The agent's face went white when Blake read the entry about Jeremy dated 2 weeks before he died, where Bo wrote necessary correction for disrespect and detailed how he'd make it look like an accident. Blake kept reading for 3 hours, his voice cracking when he got to the Oklahoma murder from 2019, a college kid named Tyler Johnson who dated one of Bo's exes. Blake admitted he'd helped move the body, helped stage the scene to look like a drug deal gone wrong, and the agents had to pause the recording when Blake threw up in the trash can. The journals had everything, photos, locations, even receipts Bo kept as trophies, and Blake said Bo made him keep copies as insurance so they'd both go down if either talked. 2 days later, the Johnson family flew in from Oklahoma City, and I watched them walk into the prosecutor's office carrying boxes of their own evidence. Mrs. Johnson had hired private investigators for years, collected witness statements from people too scared to talk to police, and she played a recording from Tyler's phone where Bo's voice said clearly that Tyler would disappear if he didn't leave town. The prosecutor started building a RICO case, showing Bo and Blake operated like a crime organization, with patterns across state lines that triggered federal jurisdiction. More victims started coming forward once word spread that Bo was locked up, and the prosecutor's assistant had to create a spreadsheet just to track all the charges. I tried going back to school on day 24, sitting in my statistics class while my phone buzzed with updates from the FBI. Everyone stared at me, whispered about the news coverage, and when the professor offered me extensions, I said no because I needed something normal, even though my hands shook too much to hold the pencil steady. I knew every formula but couldn't focus on the problems, kept seeing Bo's face in the numbers, and when I got the exam back with a 37%, I walked to my car and sat there crying until Nina found me an hour later. She held me while I sobbed about how Bo had broken everything, even things he'd never touched, and she reminded me that surviving was more important than any test score. 2 days later, Derek went to testify at the grand jury and brought thumb drives full of recordings he'd secretly made at the gym over the past year. The prosecutor played one where Bo talked about removing obstacles permanently, and another where he described what he'd do to anyone who crossed him, and Derek identified the dates and contexts for each recording. Other gym members came forward with their own stories, including a woman named Sarah, who finally reported that Bo had assaulted her in the parking garage 6 months ago, but she'd been too scared to tell anyone. The indictments kept multiplying as more evidence came in: murder, assault, stalking, fraud, conspiracy, racketeering, and the prosecutor said they were still finding new crimes. On day 28, Bo shocked everyone by firing his court-appointed lawyer during a pre-trial hearing and announcing he'd represent himself. The judge spent 20 minutes explaining why this was a terrible idea, but Bo insisted it was his constitutional right, and within an hour he'd filed 17 motions to dismiss based on what he called a conspiracy against him. He demanded to face his accusers directly, subpoenaed everyone including me, and the prosecutor warned us he'd use this to intimidate witnesses from his defense table. The FBI assigned us federal protection officers who followed us everywhere, checked our apartments for bugs, and screened our mail for threats. 2 days later, Mrs. Huang organized a memorial for Jeremy at Zilker Park where he used to run every morning. About 50 people showed up, including other people Bo had hurt over the years, and we stood in a circle sharing stories about Jeremy and about surviving Bo's violence. Local news covered it respectfully, focusing on Jeremy's life rather than his death, but Blake told his lawyer that Bo saw it on the jail TV and destroyed his cell, attacking his cellmate so badly they moved him to solitary. How did Blake manage to hide those journals from Bo for 6 whole years when they were partners in all these crimes? The detail about Bo writing necessary correction for disrespect 2 weeks before Jeremy died makes me wonder if Blake knew what was coming but couldn't stop it. Blake said Bo screamed about losing control, about how we'd all pay, and the guards had to use pepper spray to subdue him. 3 days later, Nina graduated early from her nursing program after her professors fast-tracked her final requirements given everything she'd been through. At the ceremony, she gave a speech dedicating her degree to survivors of violence and those who stand with them, and I sat in the front row crying so hard I couldn't see. Our parents drove down from Dallas, finally understanding what we'd been facing, and Dad pulled me aside afterward to apologize for telling me I was overreacting when I first called him about Bo. Mom kept touching my face like she was making sure I was really there, really alive, and they insisted on staying in town until the trial was over. 2 days later, investigators discovered Bo had been stealing dead people's identities to collect their benefits, including a Marine veteran who died in 2018. The federal fraud charges alone would have meant decades in prison, and they found over $200,000 in cash hidden in storage units around Texas. The prosecutor said the money would go to victims' families through restitution, and when Lila found out some would help with her legal fees, she broke down crying in the courthouse bathroom. Even locked up in solitary, Bo found ways to reach us through other inmates he paid with commissary money. We got calls from burner phones at 3 in the morning with just breathing, dead rats left at Nina's apartment door, letters sent to our parents with photos of me at the gym that day circled in red. The FBI traced it to 3 different inmates who admitted Bo paid them them in ramen and phone cards, and they moved him to federal holding in a different facility. I couldn't sleep, kept checking locks, kept feeling like Bo would find a way out, find a way to finish what he started, and my therapist prescribed anxiety medication that made me feel underwater, but at least let me close my eyes. On day 40, Blake stood in court in an orange jumpsuit and pled guilty to accessory charges, accepting 5 years with possibility of parole in 2. During his allocution, he spoke for 40 minutes about how Bo had controlled him since they were kids, threatened to kill his family if he didn't help, made him believe he was worthless without Bo's protection. He turned to each victim's family and apologized by name, his voice breaking when he got to Mrs. Huang, who sat in the front row with Jeremy's photo in her lap. She didn't forgive him, but thanked him for finally telling the truth, and the whole courtroom went silent, except for people crying. The judge called for a recess, and I walked out on shaking legs while Blake was taken into custody for his own sentencing hearing later. 3 weeks passed before I could function normally again, and the FBI therapist they sent me to had this tiny office with a white noise machine that made everything feel unreal. She asked me to describe what I was feeling, and I told her about checking my rearview mirror 20 times on the way there, about sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed, about seeing Bo's face in every tall man at the grocery store. She wrote down PTSD on her notepad and explained that my brain was stuck in survival mode, that Bo had rewired my nervous system to expect danger everywhere. I told her I kept having the same nightmare where he escaped from jail and came for me, and she said trauma changes how we process reality, that recovery meant learning to feel safe again, even though safety was never guaranteed. The prosecution called 2 days later saying Bo had refused their plea deal for life without parole, demanding a trial instead because he claimed I'd orchestrated everything to steal Lila from him. The prosecutor laughed when she told me, said narcissists like Bo would rather die than admit they were wrong, that he'd filed 17 motions already, including one accusing the FBI of conspiring with me. During jury selection, I had to walk past him in the courthouse hallway, and suddenly he broke free from the guards, lunging straight at me with his hands reaching for my throat. He got within 3 feet, screaming that I'd destroyed his life before 4 guards tackled him to the marble floor, his face smashing into the ground hard enough to break his nose. I couldn't move or speak, just stood there frozen while Nina pulled me away, and the guards cuffed him with his blood spreading across the white floor. The prosecutor said my freeze response was textbook PTSD, that victims often can't fight or flee when confronted by their attackers again. They added attempted assault charges and moved him to solitary until trial, but I still felt his hands reaching for me every time I closed my eyes. Coach took the stand 2 days later with a flash drive full of security footage showing every single thing Bo had done at the gym. The jury watched him follow us around, slam weights when I touched Lila, shoulder check me in the hallway, and intimidate other members until they left. 3 women testified that Bo had followed them home from the gym, one showing photos of him parked outside her apartment for hours. Coach's voice cracked when he described finding the tampered equipment, how Bo could have killed someone just to send a message. Bo tried to cross-examine each witness himself, rambling about government conspiracies and how everyone was jealous of his success, until the judge threatened to hold him in contempt. Lila took the stand the next day carrying a box of evidence that made my stomach turn. She showed the jury photos of bruises covering her ribs, medical records from 3 different hospitals, police reports spanning 5 years that went nowhere because Bo always convinced them she was crazy. She described how he'd isolated her from friends and family, made her quit her job, tracked her phone, controlled what she wore and who she talked to. When she looked directly at him and said he hadn't broken her, that she'd survived him, Bo exploded out of his chair screaming threats so violent the court reporter stopped typing. The bailiffs dragged him out while he kept screaming that she belonged to him, that he'd kill anyone who touched her, and several jurors were crying when the judge called a recess. My testimony lasted 4 hours the next morning, and Bo insisted on questioning me himself, asking about my finances, implying I was some kind of male prostitute who'd targeted him for money. He wanted to know how much Lila had really paid me, whether we'd had sex, if I'd planned this whole thing to eliminate him. The judge warned him 8 times, but he kept pushing, trying to make me angry, trying to break me down like he'd broken down everyone else in his life. I answered every question calmly, told the truth about everything, and watched his face get redder as he realized the jury wasn't buying his story. Mrs. Huang's testimony destroyed whatever sympathy might have been left for Bo. She played a voicemail Jeremy had left the night he died, his voice shaking as he said if something happened to him, it was Bo, that Bo had told him tonight was the night he'd pay for talking to Lila. The courtroom went completely silent, except for Mrs. Huang's quiet sobbing as she showed Jeremy's journal entries describing months of escalating threats and stalking. Bo claimed the voicemail was fake, that Jeremy was unstable, but then the prosecution introduced Bo's own journals that Blake had provided, showing he'd written about dealing with Jeremy permanently the day before Jeremy died. The FBI analyst presented a timeline showing Bo's pattern across 5 states over 15 years, 12 confirmed victims, 3 deaths, including Jeremy. They showed how he'd escalate from stalking to violence, how he'd move states when things got too hot, how he'd destroyed lives in Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arizona, and Nevada. Bo's closing argument was completely unhinged, claiming the FBI, his own brother, the prosecution, and I had conspired against him because we were jealous of his success with women. He looked at each juror and said he'd remember their faces, that they'd regret this, and the judge immediately added jury tampering charges. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 43 counts, including murder, attempted murder, stalking, assault, fraud, and conspiracy. Bo showed nothing on his face until they read the murder conviction for Jeremy. Then he smiled directly at me, mouthing, "See you soon," as the guards led him away in shackles. Nina held my hand as we left the courthouse, but I couldn't shake the feeling that even with a conviction, I'd never really be safe from him. 2 days later at sentencing, the judge called Bo a predator who'd destroyed lives without remorse and sentenced him to life without parole, plus 340 years to run consecutively. Bo tried to give a speech claiming I was the real criminal, that this was all a setup, but when he started threatening the judge, they dragged him out mid-sentence while he screamed about revenge. The gavel came down, and legally it was over, but I knew the trauma wouldn't end just because a judge said so, that I'd be looking over my shoulder for the rest of my life. 2 months after the trial ended, Blake started sending letters from prison to everyone who got hurt by Bo. The first one came to my apartment on a Tuesday morning, and I almost threw it away without opening it. Blake wrote 3 pages about how sorry he was for helping Bo track people and for not stopping him when things got bad. He listed other stuff Bo did that never got reported, like beating up a guy in Houston and stalking 2 women in Dallas. Blake's lawyer called me later saying Blake was getting therapy in prison and trying to make things right by helping cops close old cases. Some of the other victims wrote him back, but Mrs. Ah Huang burned his letter without reading it and posted the video online. The judge giving Bo life plus 340 years makes me wonder how they calculate such specific numbers. Does each crime add exact years? What determines if sentences run together or separately like that? 5 days later, I went back to work at the smoothie shop because my bank account was empty and bills kept coming. The first customer recognized me from the news and kept staring while I made her protein shake. Coach saw me getting uncomfortable and moved me to the back office doing inventory and schedules instead of dealing with people. Most of my co-workers were cool about everything, but a few kept asking questions about what really happened that night. My first paycheck after 2 months felt like winning the lottery, even though it was only $400. Nina started her new job at the trauma center downtown and called me excited about her first day. She was working with abuse victims and creating new ways to document injuries for court cases. Her supervisor knew about our case and asked Nina to train other nurses on spotting stalking victims. Nina texted me that night saying maybe something good could come from all the bad stuff we went through. Lila's support group kept growing, and she asked if I'd come speak to them about surviving. I helped her set up chairs and book meeting rooms, but couldn't handle talking about it yet. She started dating a social worker who specialized in trauma and seemed happier than before. We both still checked our locks multiple times before bed, though. Mrs. Huang called me about starting a foundation in Jeremy's name to help stalking victims pay for lawyers and safe housing. The first person they helped was a woman whose ex had been following her for 6 months. Mrs. Huang wanted me on the board, but I said no because I needed space from all of it. She understood and said Jeremy would be proud we stopped Bo from killing anyone else. My therapist started doing this thing called EMDR, where I moved my eyes back and forth while thinking about the parking garage. The first few sessions made me throw up, but slowly I could remember it without feeling like I was dying. I still had nightmares about Bo showing up at my door and checked for his car, even though I knew he was locked up. She kept saying healing takes time, and some days I actually believed her. The FBI agent called to say they were closing their investigation and Bo would never get out. She met me for coffee and said she'd worked hundreds of these cases, but most didn't end with a bad guy in prison. She gave me her personal number and told me to call if I ever felt unsafe again. I kept her card next to the picture of Nina and me at her graduation ceremony. School started offering summer classes online, so I signed up to make up what I failed during the trial. Statistics homework seemed stupid after almost getting murdered, but having a schedule helped me feel normal. My professor emailed asking if I was okay after seeing the news, and I wrote back that I was getting there. Derek flew in from Dallas to visit, and we went to the gym together for the first time since everything happened. He pointed at the bench where Bo used to lift those crazy weights, and now it was just regular equipment. We worked out for an hour without anyone staring or whispering about what happened there. For 60 minutes, we were just 2 normal guys lifting weights instead of survivors of a psycho. On day 100, Nina and I had dinner with our parents who stayed in town to help us get back to normal. Dad grilled burgers while Mom kept saying I looked too skinny and needed to eat more. We talked about Nina's patients and my summer classes and normal stuff instead of trials and trauma. After they left, Nina and I sat on the couch not talking but not needing to either. We made it through everything and came out different but still breathing. The apartment was quiet except for the air conditioner running, and for once I didn't check the locks before going to bed. It was a small thing, but it was mine. Alright, I think that's a good spot to wrap it up for today. Thanks for hanging out and letting me toss in my 2 cents along the way. It's been a fun little adventure. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.